Men and nature must work hand in hand. The throwing out of balance of the resources of nature throws out of balance also the lives of men. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. America was in a depression. After the stock market crashed in 1929, millions of people were left unemployed, and across the Great Plains, decades of neglectful farming left the land arid, causing massive dust storms to blow across the prairie and bury everything in its path. In 1932, unsatisfied with the job President Hebert Hoover was doing, Americans chose to take a chance on a new president, one who had fundamentally changed the country and the national park system forever. That man? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Welcome back to RAC's Presidential Park Series, where we take a look at the U.S. presidents through the national parks that honor and define them. Today we're discussing the president who served 4 terms, the longest of any commander-in-chief, and led the country through the Great Depression and a Second World War. Let's take a look at the legacy of FDR. Franklin Roosevelt was born in 1882 in New York in a place called Hyde Park. Located about halfway between New York City and the state capital Albany, Hyde Park served as a central location throughout Roosevelt's life, and the home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt National Historic Site preserves this important piece of Franklin's journey towards becoming America's 32nd president. FDR attended Harvard beginning in 1900, and the year after his graduation, he married Eleanor Roosevelt, whose name was already Roosevelt even before she married Franklin, due to being the niece of Theodore Roosevelt, and thus very distantly related to Franklin. Roosevelt would eventually get into politics and even secured a nomination for the vice presidency in the election of 1920, but his running mate James Cox ultimately lost to Warren Harding. Unfortunately for FDR, the summer of 1921 saw him struck with a condition he would have to live with for the rest of his life: polio. His legs would ultimately become paralyzed, and FDR would often be seen in a wheelchair during the rest of his life and his presidency. Polio didn't stop Roosevelt from participating in politics, though. He eventually landed himself in the governorship for the state of New York, and in 1932 won his bid for the presidency against the unpopular incumbent Hoover. Roosevelt's presidency could really be split into 2 parts: his first 2 terms, which concerned the Great Depression, and his third plus a short 4th term, which concerned the Second World War. Roosevelt's conservation efforts were mainly centered around helping to get America out of the Great Depression, so that will be the main focus of this video, but we'll discuss a little bit about his wartime presidency as well. Roosevelt immediately got to work in what would become known as the first 100 days to implement programs to help Americans across the country slowly recover from the Great Depression. Over the next several years, his larger plan would come to be known as the New Deal. In 1933, Roosevelt also helped to vastly expand the national park system, bringing in military parks from the War Department commemorating battles such as Shiloh, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg during the Civil War. In addition to military parks, many of the parks in Washington, D.C. came under NPS jurisdiction, including the Arlington House, home to Robert E. Lee before the Civil War. The last part of the reorganization involved the transfer of several monuments under the care of the Forest Service from the Department of Agriculture. These included the Devil's Post Pile in California and Mount Olympus in Washington, which would eventually become Olympic National Park a few years later. The reorganization was the biggest expansion of the Park Service since its founding in 1916, and set the tone that the NPS would now be focused on historical preservation in addition to natural conservation that it was already doing. Part of Roosevelt's New Deal involved the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. This program allowed for young men between the ages of 18 and 25 to work in parks across the country, including national parks like Zion and state parks like Washington and Missouri. For more info on the CCC, check out our video on the topic with the card in the upper right-hand corner. 2 years after the 1933 reorganization, another big step was taken towards historic preservation in the National Park Service. The 1935 Preservation of Historic Sites Act called for a policy to protect historic buildings, such as the ones related to U.S. presidents that we've discussed up to this point, and preserve them for the benefit of the public, according to the National Park Service's website. Throughout the rest of the 1930s, Roosevelt would continue to combat the effects of the Great Depression. However, in 1939, a new threat would arise in Europe. Dictator Adolf Hitler from Germany launched an invasion of neighboring Poland, causing several countries to declare war against the country. The United States initially remained neutral, but Roosevelt started to provide supplies to the Allied power consisting of Britain, France before it was captured by Germany, and eventually the Soviet Union after it was attacked by Germany. Roosevelt won an unprecedented 3rd term in 1940 on the basis of not getting involved in foreign wars. But only a year later, the war would become personal. On December 7, 1941, Japan, an ally of Germany, bombed Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii, a direct attack on the United States of America. This prompted Roosevelt to declare war on Japan, and soon after, Germany declared war on the United States. During the next 4 years, the US was mostly focused on fighting in the Second World War as opposed to visiting national parks, but parks were still being created all the same. Less than a week after the joint D-Day offensive to begin retaking France, the Big Bend of the Rio Grande on the Texas-Mexico border officially became a national park. That same year, 1944, also saw Roosevelt run for a 4th term as president, which would ultimately be his last. In the beginning of 1945, the war was drawing to a close, but Roosevelt would not get to see it. His health worsened, and on April 12, 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt passed away in Georgia. His vice president, Harry Truman, would assume the presidency following his death, but we'll discuss him in our next video. The legacy of Franklin Roosevelt is a large one, and in Washington, D.C., the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial is a tapestry of stone dedicated to his 4 terms as president, allowing visitors to take in the immense weight of what FDR had to deal with during his presidency. Due to the 22nd Amendment, no president since has been able to serve more than 2 terms, leaving Franklin Roosevelt as the longest-serving president in U.S. history to this day. Roosevelt helped evolve the National Park Service beyond natural preservation, and asked the country to broaden their idea of what exactly a unit of the National Park Service could be. And for that, the Park Service has only continued to grow and prosper in the decades following the tenure of America's 32nd president. Thanks for watching. This has been RAC Adventures covering America's presidential parks. We'll see you next time.